And thanks for inviting me to speak, and particularly for inviting me at this very slot, because this is the start of the positive bit. So, that means that we've heard all about this, and I don't need to speak about how salmon are now endangered in Great Britain. We've heard about that. John gave us stats, Nora gave us some brilliant information about what's going on there. And it also means that I don't have to talk about how populations of salmon are decreasing, and that means salmon are now in the same category as species like mountain gorillas, but in fact doing worse because mountain gorilla populations are increasing. But what I can talk about is that success is possible. And so, yeah, not elephants, but tigers instead. So the IUCN Tiger Programme has found that there's been an average increase in the tiger population between 2015 and 2021 of around 40%. And so what I can talk about now at the start of this session is how success is possible, and there's some really good examples out there. So one example that I do want to focus on in particular is this guy, who is the Saiga antelope. And he's been around since the Ice Age and migrates across national boundaries, and I'm going to check my notes here so I get the right countries that he migrates across: Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Russia, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. It's quite good that the mic went down at that point. So this species had the dubious honour of being one of the fastest declining mammals on the planet in the 1990s. And it lost over 95% of its population around that time. But what happened in December, when Atlantic salmon were reassessed as endangered, this species jumped 2 categories and went from critically endangered to near threatened. And I thought that was really interesting and might have some lessons for us in the salmon world. And it made me think that if it's possible for species like this, surely it's possible for the salmon world to look at the lessons from the Saiga antelope and see if we can learn from that and put some things in place that mean that maybe the salmon could jump 2 categories in the next assessment. So I'll talk a little bit about how this Saiga recovery happened. And I think there's 4 elements that are worth considering here. The first one is the Saiga's place in local culture. And this may sound very familiar to us here in the room. So it's been cited as absolutely crucial to the success of this recovery programme. And the Saiga is culturally symbolic for the nomadic people that roam across these countries that I was talking about. And it's been an important source of food, which I think is very important, and inspiration for these peoples for centuries. And that, again, sounds quite familiar, I think. So the second point about this recovery is coalition building. In 2016, the countries involved with this recovery programme came together under the UN Convention on Migratory Species, and they signed a memorandum of understanding. And that got them to work together to develop action plans and to report against those action plans to update them every 5 years and report against them annually. And from someone who's come from NASCO, that again sounds very familiar. The third issue is funding. And of course, funding for any restoration is very important. I think we'll come to that quite a lot during this session. And there was UN funding that came associated with the recognition of the habitat as one of the world's restoration flagships. So there was international funding. Governments funded specific programs like reducing poaching. And then there was work from something called the Saiga Conservation Alliance, also very familiar for someone working with the Missing Salmon Alliance. And they were focused on creating programs for private sources of funding, like through tourism. So again, international, government, private sources of funding to work on this program. And finally, persistence and positivity, and all of the groups working together not giving up when times were not so bad and just keeping going and having this really impressive outcome. So the point here is that it is possible to bring species back from the brink. And I see a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of similarities between the salmon world and the Saiga world, if you like. And I just want to look at these 4 issues in relation to the salmon world. So the first one, I won't dwell on too much because I think we're all very well aware of this. Salmon have a big place in local and national culture. We know that they're very important economically, environmentally, socially, and we know very well about that in this country, also to indigenous peoples in North America, to Sami in Finland, Sweden, Russia, that sort of area. So we know that wild salmon have a place in local culture. What I'm not so sure about is whether we communicate that to the wider population, not just to people like us here in the room that know all about it, but to people outside this room, the general public. Do they know how important salmon are? So there's a few clicks here that I'll probably get in the wrong place. But the second issue is about coalition building. And this was brought up earlier on. There's a busy landscape of organisations in the salmon world. Local organisations like us here in the room, national organisations, international organisations like NASCO, and then actually right across to the Pacific with the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. And there's actually clear lines of sight between us here in the room and international negotiations, as Nora said, with information being collected by boards and trusts locally, that going up to government and FMS, going up to, for example, the UK delegation to NASCO, and that feeding into negotiations for quota for salmon fishing in West Greenland. But there's also a direct line of sight more widely. So on pink salmon, Colin already talked to us about the app, but the information from that app was fed into the, and I'm going to check my notes here so I get it right, the Northern Hemisphere Pink Salmon Expert Group that Alan sat on, and that was in Vancouver about 18 months ago, where people from around the world met to talk about pink salmon, to learn about pink salmon, to look at what management interventions might work and have been tried, and how to do that effectively. So in terms of coalition building, I think the structures are already there, but perhaps we need to strengthen and align the structures, work together a little bit better to make a real difference on the ground. So I got a lift from Alison up yesterday, and I didn't tell her that she had a start in my slides, so I might be needing a lift home from someone else. Obviously, investment is very important, and I talked about investment in the Saiga world, and there's been an increasing interest in nature, positive finance in the salmon world in particular, in the wake of COP26 in Glasgow to do with climate change, and also to do with the global biodiversity framework and its ambition to reverse nature loss by 2030. And I won't say too much about this because Paul is going to enlighten us further very shortly, I believe. But there's actually lots of brilliant examples of private sector funding coming into the salmon world and funding restoration of habitats and biodiversity and river health and so on. The Chivers projects, the Rivers Within project was announced last week, and that's a really good example of funding for 3 different organisations represented in this room, I believe, to fund activity along riverbanks and waterways to increase the health of our river ecosystem. So although there's lots of really brilliant examples of private investment or private funding in our sector, perhaps we need to do a little bit more to make sure we are investment ready, have our projects ready, have our governance ready, have our systems ready, our monitoring ready. And I think perhaps there's work that could be done in that area. So the final element that I talked about with respect to the Saiga was persistence and positivity, and I think that's where I come in here and where the Missing Salmon Alliance comes in. The Missing Salmon Alliance would like to activate this urgent, renewed focus on wild salmon. And so I've been brought in to pull that together. And it's actually been really interesting talking to lots of people last night and today at breakfast and at lunch, because I think everyone's really up for this, really up for pulling together and trying to move things forward, especially in the wake of that IUCN assessment. So there's three things that we're going to focus on with Wild Salmon Connections. The first one is really trying to get that message out about how important wild salmon is. Make sure the message is out there and make sure it's accessible and visible to the wider public rather than just the people in the room. The second element is to strengthen and align organisations, to not just perhaps moan about organisations that are not doing what we want them to do, but looking at how we can work with them and take steps to improve what's happening so that wild salmon can benefit at the end. And then the final element is to look at mobilising nature finance for the benefit of wild Atlantic salmon. So this is the three focus points, I suppose, of Wild Salmon Connections. And I've had lots of excellent discussions so far, but if you have brilliant examples of where wild salmon is shown in our culture, or examples of actions that have led to brilliant successes, or just really good partnerships that's made a difference on the ground, then please do get in touch. It'd be great to hear about that. And I think I will finish there.